Ronald Reagan left the White House in 1989. At 78 years old, he was the oldest person to ever hold the office of President of the United States. But long before he arrived on the national political scene, he had been crafting a political persona of distinct charm and sincerity. He evolved from a youthful New Deal liberal to a tireless campaigner for conservative causes. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in Tampico, Illinois on February 6, 1911. The Reagan family moved frequently before settling in Dixon, Illinois, just west of Chicago. Reagan recalled a happy childhood, although his father drank a great deal and had difficulty keeping a job. His mother was a strong person and spent much of the time volunteering for her church. She taught young Ron to read at a young age and encouraged both of her sons to go to college in spite of their financial situation. She also loved the theater, and from her, Ronald Reagan learned how much he loved to perform. At the age of 17, he won a scholarship to Eureka College in Peoria, where he majored in economics. He was student body president, a member of the football team, and captain of the swimming team. Upon graduation in 1932, job hunting during the Great Depression was bleak. He dreamed of becoming an actor, but took a job as a local radio sportscaster in Davenport, Iowa to support himself. By 1936, at the age of 22, he became a sportscaster for station WHO, a powerful NBC affiliate located in Des Moines, Iowa. When the Chicago Cubs played, Reagan received little bits of information about the game over the telegraph. From that information, he invented background details to make it all sound exciting. A year later, in 1937, Reagan went to Hollywood to pursue an acting career that would span more than 25 years. His most memorable movie role was playing the Gipper in Newt Rockne, All-American, in 1940.
George. Yes, Rock. George, this telegram just arrived from Walter Camp. You've been named fullback on his All-American team.
Me? You wouldn't kid me, Rock.
No, it's on the level. You're gonna be all right, kid.
I haven't got a complaint in the world, Rock. I'm not afraid. What's tough about this? Rock, someday when the team's up against it, breaks are beating the boys, ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Gipper. I don't know where I'll be then, but I'll know about it. I'll be happy.
That same year, he married actress Jane Wyman, and they had 2 children, Maureen and Michael, an adopted son. The marriage ended in divorce 8 years later. In Hollywood, he soon became active in the Screen Actors Guild, the union for film actors, and was elected its president 6 times. He met Nancy Davis, who was an aspiring actress. In 1952, they married and had 2 children, Patricia and Ronald. As the Guild president, Reagan encountered firsthand the anti-communist politics of the era. He actively worked to remove suspected communists from the movie industry. And in 1947, when the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities began its investigation regarding the influence of communists in the film industry, Reagan took a strong anti-communist stand, testifying before the committee. Though his career as an actor ebbed, Reagan's articulate presence led to a job as host of General Electric Theater on TV from 1954 to 1962. As spokesperson for GE, he also traveled throughout the United States, making speeches about the importance of the free enterprise system and the dangers of too much federal control. In 1964, he gained nationwide political attention when he delivered an impassioned television speech supporting the Republican presidential candidate, Senator Barry Goldwater.
Those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. In this vote harvesting time, they use terms like the Great Society, or as we were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. But they've been a little more explicit in the past, and among themselves, and all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the President as our moral teacher and our leader, and he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. He must be freed so that he can do for us what he knows is best. And Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as the masses. This is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the full power of centralized government, this was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. Yet any time you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, we're denounced as being against their humanitarian goals. They say we're always against things, we're never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so. Now,
although Goldwater lost the election to Lyndon Johnson, Reagan's speech raised money and gained praise from Republicans throughout the country. Reagan was persuaded in 1966 to run for governor of California. His politics appealed to both traditional Republican voters and working-class Democrats. He soundly defeated incumbent Governor Edmund Pat Brown. Reagan became widely known as a conservative politician who wanted to restrict government involvement in the economy and society. In 1968, he unsuccessfully tried to become the Republican candidate for president but lost to Richard M. Nixon, who went on to win the presidency. 2 years later, in 1970, he was elected to his second term as California's governor. In 1976, Reagan, no longer governor, devoted himself full-time to campaigning for the Republican presidential nomination. This time, he narrowly lost the bid to incumbent President Gerald Ford, who then lost the presidential contest to Georgia Democrat Jimmy Carter. Undaunted, Reagan made plans for 1980 and became the immediate favorite. As the campaign began, the single biggest political issue was the bleak economy. Due to inflation, prices rose at the rate of 13% a year. Middle East nations began to sell less crude oil, causing long lines at gas stations. Gasoline and oil became very expensive. Simultaneously, the number of unemployed workers had begun to increase, and the U.S. economy was falling behind those of West Germany and Japan. In the wake of failure in Vietnam, Americans lacked confidence in their own country. Many people thought that U.S. military strength had fallen behind that of the Soviet Union in the late 70s. The Cold War was still raging, and at the end of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and seemed to be successfully challenging the influence of the United States in Africa and Central America. In November 1979, Iranian militants captured the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 American citizens hostage. Reagan accused Carter of weakness in foreign policy and called for a stronger military. His criticism seemed substantiated as the hostage crisis lengthened and Carter refused to meet the demands of the Iranians. On television, the contrast between the two men was acute. Carter was stiff and almost nervous in his manner. Reagan, on the other hand, was charismatic. His call for a return to patriotism and traditional morality was an encouraging message to the American voters. In his landslide victory, Reagan received 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was sworn in as 40th President of the United States.
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise. It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We're not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams. And after all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans.
His first official act on Inauguration Day was to sign an executive order removing price controls on oil and gasoline. Then shortly after noon on that same day, he announced that President Carter's efforts to free the American captives who had been held in Iran for 444 days had finally been successful. The Americans were on their way home. Perhaps the most important decision made by President Reagan during his first term was to concentrate on just two goals: reduce taxes and raise defense spending. In addition, he would strive to appoint more conservative justices to the Supreme Court and balance the federal budget. Like many presidents before him, Reagan did not consult his cabinet. Rather, he worked with a kitchen cabinet of close advisors. He relied heavily on their advice and concentrated on his role as the great communicator. He worked from index cards prepared each day by his staff. The cards contained his daily schedule, jokes, and stories to use on certain occasions, and key phrases to explain his position on the issues. As he placed his team members, he immediately sought to lower income tax rates. He believed that if more money was returned to taxpayers, they would save more, and if taxpayers put more of their paychecks into bank accounts and government bonds, more money would be available to the government and for banks to loan to businesses. His strategy to balance the budget was labeled supply-side economics, or commonly dubbed Reaganomics. Early polls showed that the American public and the president disagreed on several counts. A February 1981 poll by CBS and the New York Times found that the public did not favor more defense spending over a balanced budget. Those polled were against large tax cuts. They also opposed certain budget cuts that Reagan favored: cuts in Social Security, mass transit, pollution control, and aid to students. Then on March 30th, 1981, only 60 days after taking office, an assassination attempt on Reagan seemed to alter the public temperament. His grace and wit during the incident caused his popularity to soar. After a dramatic televised speech to Congress on April 28, 1981, less than 1 month after the attempt on his life, Reagan won a substantial legislative victory on a comprehensive budget resolution that incorporated every element of his budget policy: increases for defense, decreases for domestic programs, and a huge tax cut. In July 1981, Congress passed the largest tax cut bill in American history. Although the bill cut nearly $750 billion over the next 6 years, the cut was smaller than the president had requested. As his first term continued, Reagan also obtained approval in spending cuts for government social programs such as job training, college loans, food and medical programs, payments for those with disabilities, child daycare centers, and centers for the elderly. He contended that many of these programs made individuals dependent on the government and weakened the American family structure. In the second year of his administration, his economic plan had results. 1982 was marred by a severe recession. By the fall, 11% of the workforce was unemployed and interest rates remained high. Believing that the removal of government restrictions would allow businesses to save money as well as the time spent complying with regulations, he persuaded Congress to deregulate many industries. It was hoped that this would ultimately stimulate investing in new areas. While the economic recovery was a primary focus, by mid-1981, arms control had become a major world concern. Reagan was convinced that the time was right to change the situation. He had long been suspicious of communism and had once called the Soviet Union the evil empire, the focus of evil in the world, but he saw the need for compromise. With the help of Secretary of State George Shultz, President Reagan began writing and talking to Soviet leaders. His strong verbal stance toward communism and the Soviet Union portrayed Reagan as a man in charge. Reagan continued Jimmy Carter's policy of aiding anti-Russian rebels in Afghanistan, despite the fact that they were Muslim fundamentalists like those who kept the hated Khomeini in power in Iran. In 1983, he sent U.S. Marines to assist Lebanon, a country greatly weakened by its complex war that involved religion and foreign intervention. On the morning of October 23, 1983, a yellow Mercedes truck drove into the parking lot of the four-story building where the Marines slept. The explosive-laden truck blew up, killing 241 sleeping U.S. Marines. Reagan withdrew the force. Early the next morning, 1,900 American troops landed in the small Caribbean country of Grenada in a surprise maneuver to rescue the 800 American medical students enrolled at St. George's University School of Medicine. After the assassination of its Marxist leader, Grenada was in chaos. In addition, armed workers were building an airstrip on the island that the U.S. feared would fall to Cuban or Soviet control. American soldiers quickly captured Grenada and flew the students back home. Although critics feared that one invasion would lead to others, the president's action was initially popular. A year later, in November 1984, Ronald Reagan and George Bush won an overwhelming victory against Democratic candidate Walter Mondale and his running mate Geraldine Ferraro, the first female vice presidential nominee of a major American political party. Reagan's goals for his second term remained the same. On the domestic front, he would continue efforts to reduce federal spending and bring down the deficit. He would push for more tax reform and increased military spending. In regards to foreign policy goals, his major goal was to sign an arms reduction agreement with the Soviet Union. He also hoped to further peace in the Middle East and help prevent further communist intrusion in Central America. The nation was gradually recovering from the recession. Inflation and unemployment rates had improved. However, private savings and business investments were down, and the gap between the richest and poorest Americans had widened. But Reagan's foreign affairs successes drew public attention away from the sluggish economy. When Reagan first became president, relations with the Soviet Union were more strained than they had been for 20 years. Many Americans felt vulnerable to what appeared to be a large weapon buildup by the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union has been engaged in the greatest military buildup in the history of man. And it cannot be described as necessary for their defense. It is plainly a buildup that is offensive in nature.
In 1983, Reagan convinced Congress to allocate money for research on a defense system to prevent nuclear missiles from hitting U.S. cities, an umbrella effect that would knock out nuclear missiles when they came out of the silos. This strategic defense initiative was nicknamed Star Wars and was announced to the nation in March 1983. In spite of his critics, Reagan was convinced that SDI could be developed. Some scientists simply said it wouldn't work. Military experts noted that lasers in space would not affect low-flying missiles and planes. Bankers worried that the astronomical costs of the project would bankrupt the United States. Nevertheless, Reagan made his case.
We seek to render obsolete the balance of terror, or mutual assured destruction as it's called, and replace it with a system incapable of initiating armed conflict or causing mass destruction, yet effective in preventing war. Now, this is not and should never be misconstrued as just another method of protecting missile silos. The Strategic Defense Initiative has been labeled Star Wars, but it isn't about war. It's about peace. It isn't about retaliation. It's about prevention. It isn't about fear. It's about hope.
In 1985, shortly after Reagan began his second term in office, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union. For years, Reagan had handwritten letters to various Soviet leaders in an attempt to open communication, but to no avail. Finally, with Gorbachev's new leadership approach, Reagan found an opportunity to shine. A series of 4 summit meetings began on November 19, 1985. The first meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev established a good working relationship. The two leaders, with their interpreters, spent 5 hours alone together in Geneva and agreed to hold 2 more meetings. The next meeting at Reykjavik, Iceland, proved the most difficult. Both Reagan and Gorbachev wanted to make enough progress on disarmament so it would be possible to have treaties ready to sign at the 3rd summit. This time, the two men spent almost 10 hours together, and for a while it appeared they were going to make the greatest arms cuts in history. The stumbling block was SDI. Gorbachev insisted that the United States agree not to test it. Reagan refused and even offered to share it with the Soviets if it worked. When Gorbachev refused to concede, Reagan abruptly stood up and walked out of the meeting. Although it seemed a disastrous failure, the Reykjavik meeting showed progress toward a treaty on intermediate-range missiles that could be signed on a 3rd meeting. In addition, Reagan's tough stance allowed Gorbachev to convince other Soviet leaders that if they wanted U.S. missiles out of Europe, as well as improved relations with the United States, they could not insist on an end to SDI. 14 months later, on December 8, 1987, they met in Washington, D.C. This time, they signed the INF Treaty, an agreement that eliminated all intermediate and short-range missiles. Within 3 years, 859 U.S. and 1,836 Soviet nuclear weapons, with a range from 300 to 3,400 miles, would be destroyed. When Reagan and Gorbachev met again 6 months later, the two countries had already signed an agreement providing for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. The 1988 meeting in Moscow symbolized the end of the Cold War between the two world superpowers. Clearly, there is little argument that Reagan was well suited to deal with Gorbachev. He met the challenge with optimism, self-confidence, and a genuine horror of nuclear war. While he wanted to be liked by the Soviet leader, he could not be accused of being weak. But if his success in nuclear arms reduction was his greatest moment, his judgment during the Iran-Contra affair was his weakest. From his first day in office, Reagan stood particularly tough on the issue of dealing with 3 nations in the Middle East, Syria, Libya, and Iran, that appeared to be helping terrorist organizations. Early on, he announced that his administration would adhere to the existing policy that nothing should be done to reward terrorists for releasing hostages. However, secretly, the Reagan administration decided to sell U.S. weapons to Iran. This was a direct violation of U.S. policy. Reagan's position on Central America was controversial. Many liberal critics opposed U.S. support of a repressive government in El Salvador and its opposition to the revolutionary Sandinista government of Nicaragua. When, in 1983, El Salvador elected a moderate over the extreme rightist as president, criticism of Reagan's policy in that country faded. However, many members of Congress continued to oppose any American support of the Nicaraguan Contras, as they were called, guerrillas fighting the leftist Sandinista government of Nicaragua. Some contended that the United States was causing turmoil in an already wretched and misgoverned country by perpetuating war. Beginning in October 1984, a worried Congress attached the Boland Amendment to a number of foreign aid bills. This amendment prohibited the U.S. government from directly aiding military action in Nicaragua. Reagan did not like the restriction. So in February 1985, his top aides devised a plan to circumvent the amendment secretly when they decided to sell U.S. weapons to Iran. Their motivation was to secure the release of 7 Americans held hostage by terrorists in Beirut, Lebanon, and to possibly influence an improved relationship with Iranians in the future. Apparently, without informing Reagan and 2 national security advisors, Oliver North, a Marine colonel, secretly sold 18 Hawk missiles to Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. While some of the huge profits from the deal simply disappeared into the pockets of private arms dealers, the balance was given to the Nicaraguan Contras. The role of the president in the affair was never clearly defined. Reagan modified his story several times. He had either sanctioned violation of the Boland Amendment, or he did not know what was going on in his own administration. Public reaction to the Iran-Contra affair was swift and dramatic. Reagan's approval rating fell from 67% to 46% in 1 month. The diversion of funds to the Contras was consistent with the administration's hardline anti-communist Central American policy. However, in view of Congress's 1985 ban on aid to the Contras, the action was publicly regarded as illegal. The Iran-Contra scandal made the headlines. His critics were outraged. But Ronald Reagan was no ordinary political target. Times were good. Stocks and real estate values were rising. The American public seemed not to notice. Whatever the truth was, upon conclusion of the televised Iran-Contra congressional hearings in the summer of 1987, Reagan characteristically recaptured a large measure of public approval. He became known as the Teflon president. No criticism or missteps could drag this president's popularity down for very long. By the end of the year, with the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, Reagan had fully resumed the political high ground. Indeed, through 1988, his approval rating improved steadily and eventually reached 63%. Reaganomics was largely successful from 1981 to 1986. 13 million new jobs were created, though few of those went to unskilled workers. The stock market boomed, inflation dropped dramatically, real family income increased. However, the boom came to an end in 1986. Cuts in government spending hurt the poorest segment of society, while the wealthiest segment increased their gains. And although he had vowed to reduce the national debt, Reagan's successor, George Bush, inherited a deficit of almost $2.7 trillion, almost 3 times what it had been when he first took office in 1981. The scandal of the Iran-Contra affair marred his foreign policy successes. Reagan's anti-government, anti-regulation position and his hands-off management style were blamed for ethics lapses among staff members. Despite some setbacks, Reagan did have worthy accomplishments. He appointed the first woman Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. He worked well with Congress to pass laws to stimulate economic growth, curb inflation, and strengthen national defense. He bargained skillfully with leaders of the Soviet Union, and his arms reduction efforts hastened the end of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. As an actor used to being on camera, he built a personal popularity that was his powerful political tool. Through a sense of familiarity, he kindled the public's trust and did not allow criticism to distract him. In the waning days of his presidency, Reagan's approval rating was 70%, the highest public approval rating for any president since Franklin Roosevelt.
We did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.